Imagine being forced to marry the most dangerous man in New York, a mafia boss who controls half the city's underworld. A man whose name alone makes people disappear, but here's the twist. He's confined to a cane, hiding a disability that could get him killed if his enemies ever found out. And you're just a broke nurse from Brooklyn drowning in your deadbeat father's debt, barely surviving on 2 shifts a day, carrying a secret inside you that could destroy everything the moment he discovers it. In the dark streets of Manhattan, where power is measured in blood and loyalty is just another word for leverage, where the smell of expensive whiskey mixes with the echo of gunshots in underground clubs, a 27-year-old woman who's lost everything, her mother to poverty, her father to gambling, her dignity to desperation, is about to walk into a penthouse overlooking Central Park and come face to face with a man she expected to be a monster. But what she didn't expect was the broken architect hiding behind the cold-blooded kingpin, a man who hasn't let anyone touch his scars in over 2 decades, a man who'd rather burn the whole empire down than admit he's terrified of being abandoned again. She thought she was signing a contract. He thought he was buying a convenience. But neither of them knew that this forced marriage would crack open wounds they'd spent their whole lives sealing shut, and what comes pouring out might just be the kind of love that doesn't ask permission, the kind that survives bullets and betrayal and secrets that should have torn them apart. So if you've ever believed that 2 shattered people can't build something beautiful together, this story is going to prove you dead wrong. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that'll keep you up tonight. Smash subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because trust us, you're not going to want to miss this one. Now let's go back to that rainy November night in Manhattan, when Felicity Brennan walked into a lawyer's office on the 40th floor, and her whole life changed with a single piece of paper. November rain lashed against the thick glass panes of the law office on the 40th floor, the sound of water tapping in a steady rhythm, like a countdown to how much time Felicity had left before her life collapsed completely. She sat in a freezing leather chair, her trembling fingers turning each page of the file attorney Edmund Hale had just pushed across the gleaming oak desk. The numbers danced before her eyes like a death sentence. $800,000 in principal, money her father Connor Brennan had borrowed from the Fontaine organization 4 years earlier to cover his gambling debts, then borrowed again, and lost again, interest piling on interest, one layer giving birth to another, until the figure had swollen into $2,800,000, a number Felicity couldn't earn, even if she worked for the rest of her life. Edmund Hale was a man of about 60, with silver hair combed neatly back, a perfectly tailored gray suit, and a voice so even and emotionless that it was clear he was long accustomed to delivering verdicts that changed other people's lives. He explained that Connor Brennan had disappeared 3 months earlier, without a message, without a trace, leaving behind a monstrous debt. And under the laws of the world the Fontaine organization operated by, a father's debt became the child's burden, blood bound blood, and there were no exceptions. Felicity felt nausea rise into her throat, but she swallowed it down and forced herself to focus. She was a nurse practitioner at a community clinic in Harlem, earning $3,200 a month, living in a studio apartment in Bushwick, Brooklyn, so small it was the size of a rich person's bathroom. She had no assets, no family other than the irresponsible father who had run away, and now she was carrying on her shoulders a debt of nearly $3 million, owed to people to whom refusal wasn't an option. She asked Edmund in a dry, brittle voice what they wanted, because clearly she had no money. Edmund didn't answer directly. Instead, he opened a drawer and took out a small black card, its front embossed in gold, with an address on Central Park South and the words, "The Meridian," while the back held only a single line, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. "Mr. Fontaine wants to meet you in person," Edmund said, placing the card in the center of the desk as though setting down the one move that would decide the game. "And I strongly advise you not to refuse." Felicity took the card with numb fingers, feeling its weight, not from the material itself but from what it meant, because this wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. She stepped out of the building into the curtain of November rain in Manhattan, the cold wind slicing through the only thin coat she owned, rainwater mixing with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. On the subway ride back to Brooklyn, she sat among strangers worn down by a long day, her hand clenched tightly around the black card inside her coat pocket, her mind spinning through possibilities she already knew were hopeless. By the time she reached her studio, Felicity hadn't even turned on the light before she rushed straight to the sink and vomited violently. She thought it was stress, fear, the fact that the only dinner she'd had that day was a granola bar eaten in a hurry between shifts. She refused to dwell on the other possibility, the one she already knew to be true. The secret she had been desperately shielding since the moment she signed that contract, knowing it made her position 1,000 times more precarious. That night she lay on the folding bed, her eyes fixed on the stained ceiling, trying to picture the man she would meet the next morning. In her mind, Asher Fontaine was an old man of about 60, heavy around the middle, balding, a cigar in his mouth, sitting behind an oak desk in a smoke-filled room, the kind of crime boss she'd seen in movies. She imagined his voice rough and gravelly, his eyes cold as stone, and the meeting ending with her on her knees, begging for more time to repay the debt. She was completely wrong about the man waiting for her in the penthouse of the Meridian Tower, and she was even more wrong about the price he would demand, because it wasn't money. The next morning, Felicity stood before the Meridian Tower on Central Park South, her head tilted back as she looked up at the black glass building rising straight into the gray sky like a blade driven into the clouds. She had changed outfits 3 times before leaving her studio, finally choosing the only white blouse she owned that was still in decent condition and the black slacks she wore to work, because she didn't own anything more elegant than that. 2 security guards in black suits stood in the lobby, communication devices in their ears, their eyes sweeping over her from head to toe, before one of them spoke into the microphone attached to his wrist and said that Mr. Fontaine's guest had arrived. A private elevator carried her up to the penthouse in silence, and when the doors opened, a woman of about 55, with silver hair pinned neatly into a bun and dressed in deep navy, greeted her with a warmth in her smile that felt almost startling in the cold atmosphere of the entire building. "I am Moira Kent, Mr. Fontaine's housekeeper," she said, her voice carrying the gentle trace of an Irish accent. "You must be Miss Brennan. He is waiting for you in his study." Moira led Felicity down a long corridor, where every footstep echoed across black marble floors, polished so brightly they looked like the surface of night water. The walls hung with paintings whose names Felicity didn't know, but was certain each one cost more than her salary for an entire year. The study stood at the end of the hallway, its heavy walnut door opening into a vast room with leather-bound bookshelves covering 3 walls from floor to ceiling, an enormous desk set at the center, and behind it, a wall of glass stretching from floor to ceiling with a direct view over Central Park, where the bare trees of late autumn spread below like a brown-gray carpet. A man stood with his back to her beside that wall of glass, tall, broad-shouldered, his silhouette cut against the gray sky. When he turned around, Felicity had to tighten every muscle in her face to keep from showing her shock. Asher Fontaine wasn't the bloated 60-year-old man with a cigar in his mouth that she had imagined the night before. He looked to be about 37, tall, lean in a sharp-edged way rather than a fragile one, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that followed every line of his body, his dark hair pushed back, and his cold gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as though he were reading every thought in her mind. But the thing that caught Felicity's attention most wasn't his face or the suit, but the cane. His right hand held a silver-handled cane, and when he moved toward the desk, every step was precise, slow, and controlled, as if he had practiced 1,000 times to turn the limp into something deliberate, rather than weak. "Miss Brennan," he said, and his voice was deep and measured, each word falling with a weight of its own. "Sit down." Felicity lowered herself into the leather chair across from the desk, her back straight, her chin lifted, refusing to let this room or this man swallow her whole even though her heart was pounding wildly inside her chest. Asher sat down, leaned the cane against the side of the desk, opened a file, and got straight to the point without a single polite preface. "Your father owes my organization $2,800,000, he said. "He disappeared and left that debt to you. I could collect it the traditional way, but I have another proposal." He looked directly into her eyes. "A contract marriage. 1 year. You live here in this penthouse. The debt is erased in full, and after 1 year we divorce cleanly, and you walk away free." Felicity almost laughed at the absurdity of the offer, but when she looked into Asher Fontaine's eyes, there was nothing remotely humorous there. She asked why a man who controlled half of New York's underworld would need a bankrupt nurse from Brooklyn to be his wife. Asher was silent for a few seconds, his fingers tapping lightly against the surface of the desk. Then he said that 2 years earlier he had been the target of an assassination attempt. The bullet had damaged his spine, he had survived, but his right leg had never fully recovered. In his world, Disability meant weakness, and weakness meant death. He needed an image of stability, a lawful wife, someone clean, untouched by the underworld, so that his allies would believe he was still unshaken and, most of all, so that Byron Shaw, the crime boss who controlled the Southern Territory and was looking day and night for a way to overthrow him, wouldn't catch even the faintest scent of weakness. Felicity listened as each word landed in her ears with the heaviness of lead. And she realized that she wasn't simply being invited into a fake marriage, she was being invited into a deadly chess match, whose rules she didn't even know. Before she could answer, Asher opened a drawer and took out an old envelope gone yellow with age. "Your father left this before he disappeared," he said, sliding it across the desk. Felicity opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter in Connor Brennan's familiar crooked script, only a few lines long, and by the time she finished reading it, she felt as though she'd been punched in the chest. "Take care of my daughter. She is the only thing I ever did right in my life." Felicity folded the letter back up, swallowing down the swell of tears in her throat, then lifted her eyes to Asher Fontaine. He was watching her with unreadable gray eyes, and for one brief moment she thought she saw something buried deep beneath the ice. Not pity, but something close to understanding. He rose, took up his cane, walked to the window overlooking Central Park, and said without turning back, "Your father believed we might be able to save each other. The question is whether you're brave enough to try." The question hung in the silent room on the 40th floor above Manhattan, and Felicity understood that it was both a promise and a threat, because no matter what she chose, her life from this moment on would never be the same again. 1 week later, Felicity Brennan returned to the Meridian Tower with a small suitcase holding nearly everything she owned in this world. A few changes of clothes, a spare pair of work shoes, the book her mother had given her before she died, and a will of iron she had forged across 7 sleepless nights. Asher was standing in the main living room, leaning lightly on his silver-handled cane beside the wall of glass overlooking Central Park. When he saw the suitcase, his gray eyes paused on it for a brief moment before lifting to hers, and Felicity could have sworn she saw something close to surprise flicker across his face, as if he hadn't truly believed she would come back. "I accept," Felicity said, setting the suitcase down on the marble floor, "but I have conditions." A smile so slight it was nearly invisible touched the corner of Asher's mouth. "Of course," he said. "I'm listening." Felicity drew in a deep breath and began. "First, this is entirely an arrangement, with no misunderstanding about the nature of this relationship. Second, she would continue working at the clinic in Harlem, and her schedule, her work, and her life there were not to be interfered with by anyone. Third, after 1 year, they would both review the situation, and if either of them wanted it to end, then it would end civilly. Fourth, absolute secrecy. No one outside could know that this was a contract marriage. Asher listened without interrupting, his fingers tapping slowly against the head of his cane. When she finished, he nodded and said, "Now my turn. First, Moira manages everything in this house, and her decisions are to be respected. She's been here longer than anyone, and knows better than even I do how this place runs. Second, we eat the main evening meal together when we're both here. I don't require us to pretend we're in love, but 2 people living under the same roof should at least treat each other with respect. Third, if at any point you feel unsafe for any reason, you tell me immediately. This must be your home, not your prison." He stopped there, and Felicity realized she was holding her breath, waiting for the 4th condition. "Fourth," Asher said, his voice a little softer now. "Even if the circumstances aren't normal, at the very least we try to be friends." Felicity was startled by that last condition. It was gentler than anything she had expected from a Mafia boss. She held out her hand. "Deal." When Asher took it, Felicity felt 2 things at once. The long scars across the back of his hand, rough and hard beneath her fingers, and a current that shot up her arm so suddenly she almost pulled away. His eyes darkened for a moment, and she wondered if he had felt the same thing. The next morning they went to the Manhattan City Clerk's office on Worth Street. The ceremony took place in a small room under fluorescent lights with the smell of old paper in the air. No flowers, no music, no guests, except 2 witnesses. Moira stood on the left, her eyes red-rimmed though she tried to hide it behind a smile. Reese Fontaine stood on the right, Asher's half-brother, 40 years old, nearly as tall as Asher, but built more solidly, his sharply cut face carrying the permanent vigilance of a man who had spent his whole life in the underworld. But when he watched Asher sign the marriage license, The corner of Reese's mouth lifted in a strange, faint smile. Felicity wore a simple navy dress she had bought with the last of her tip money, and there was nothing about her that suggested a bride, except the slender platinum bracelet Asher had given her before they left the penthouse that morning. It had rested inside a small blue velvet box, delicate and obviously expensive, yet not showy. "It was my mother's," Asher said when she opened the box, his voice flat. Though Felicity was beginning to learn how to hear what lived beneath that voice, she left it behind when she went away. At least it should belong to someone who stayed. Those words struck Felicity in the chest harder than any blow, because inside them was an entire lifetime of abandonment folded into a single sentence. When the clerk invited them to kiss, Asher leaned in and pressed his lips to her cheek, but so close to her mouth that his warm breath brushed her skin, and Felicity felt the pulse in her throat break into chaos. "It's done," he whispered, low enough that only she could hear, his deep voice sending a shiver through her. In the black Mercedes, driven by a private chauffeur back to the penthouse, they sat in silence until the car stopped at a red light on Broadway, and Asher turned to her. "Do you regret it?" Felicity looked at him, the man who was now officially her husband on paper, his face still sharp and cold, but his gray eyes carrying something she couldn't yet name. "Ask me that after 1 year," she answered, just as the light turned green. Their first dinner as husband and wife had been prepared specially by Moira. Perfectly grilled steak, mashed potatoes, and a red wine. Felicity was certain cost more than the rent of her old apartment, but she only took a small sip before setting it down when that familiar wave of nausea rose again. The surprise was Asher, sitting in the private dining room with only the two of them, with no one to perform for, no allies to reassure, no enemies to watch. He was completely different. He told her about the time when he had been a young lawyer just starting out, about the first case in which he had stood before a judge and forgotten his entire argument, about how he had improvised for 15 minutes and somehow still won. He laughed while telling it, and that laugh changed Asher Fontaine's face completely. The sharp lines softened, his gray eyes lit up, and in that moment he looked like the man he might have become if life hadn't forced him down another road. When Felicity went up to her private room that night, set her small suitcase inside a suite larger than her old Brooklyn apartment by 3 times, and looked out at the flickering lights of Manhattan through the window, she wondered whether this was the smartest decision or the most foolish one she had ever made in her life, because tomorrow morning she would wake up in the home of a Mafia boss as his wife, and the most frightening thing wasn't the dangerous world outside, but the sound of his laughter still echoing in her mind until she drifted into sleep. By the 5th week, life in the penthouse had settled into a rhythm Felicity hadn't expected she would grow used to so quickly. Every morning she woke at 6, went down to the dining room where Moira had already laid out breakfast, and Asher was always there before her, his hair still damp from his shower, the scent of cedarwood soap faint in the air, one hand wrapped around a cup of black coffee, the other turning the pages of the Financial Times. They ate together in a strange silence that wasn't uncomfortable at all. Sometimes he asked whether the clinic would be busy that day. Sometimes she asked whether he had to go to court, brief exchanges between two people living under the same roof, who were slowly learning how to exist inside the same space. After breakfast, Felicity took the subway to the community clinic in Harlem. Asher had offered to have a car drive her, but she refused because she didn't want a black Mercedes parked outside a place where most of her patients were homeless people and single mothers surviving on public assistance. Each evening she returned to the penthouse, changed clothes, and often sat reading in Asher's private library, a room smaller than his main study but far warmer, with dark wood walls, soft golden light, and shelves filled not only with books on law and business, but also literature, philosophy, and titles. Felicity would have never expected a Mafia boss to read. It was in that room, one afternoon, when Asher hadn't yet come home, that Felicity accidentally found the thing that completely changed the way she saw the man she had married. She was looking for a book on immigration law for a patient at the clinic when her fingers brushed the spine of an old brown leather volume wedged between 2 thick books. When she pulled it free, she saw it wasn't a book at all, but a sketchbook. Inside were architectural drawings in black ink, so exquisite that Felicity had to stop breathing for a moment. A hospital with a glass dome that welcomed natural light into every patient room, a community theater with a facade opening onto the square so music could spill into the street, a pedestrian bridge curving softly like a ribbon over a river. Each drawing was accompanied by notes in the margins, in a sharp, neat hand that she recognized as Asher's. Not technical notes, but reflections on how light heals, on space as the breath of a city, on the responsibility of a designer to the people who would one day live inside the structures he created. She was reading a passage about how a hospital should be built so that patients could see the sky from every corner of the room when Asher's voice came from the doorway. "Did you find something interesting?" Felicity startled and closed the sketchbook, but she knew it was already too late. Asher stood at the threshold, leaning on his cane, his face unreadable, but his shoulders tense in the way Felicity was beginning to recognize as the sign that he felt exposed. She didn't apologize, because she wasn't sorry. Instead, she asked him directly, "You drew these?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Asher was silent for a few seconds, then stepped into the room and sat down in the chair across from her. "I studied architecture at Columbia," he said, his voice flat, as though he were reading from someone else's biography. "I started at 16. Full scholarship. My professors said I had a gift. I wanted to design hospitals for communities that couldn't afford them. The kind of place that, if it had existed when your mother was still alive, she might not have died." That last sentence struck Felicity like a slap, because he remembered what she had told him about her mother during their first dinner, and he had silently woven it into the story of his own life without her ever knowing. "Then what happened?" Felicity asked, though she already knew the answer. "My father was killed," Asher said, his voice never wavering, but his fingers tightening around the handle of his cane until his knuckles turned white. The man he trusted most, his closest ally, put a knife in his back. I was 16. One night I was an architecture student, and the next morning I had to take over an empire I never wanted, because Reese had been severely injured and traumatized in that same attack, and everyone who depended on the Fontaine family would have been swallowed whole if I hadn't stepped up. He looked at the sketchbook in Felicity's hands. "Architecture is where the truth lives when it can't find a place in my world." The words hung in the air between them, and Felicity felt something shift inside her chest. Not pity, but a painful kind of understanding for a man who had buried his dream in order to carry someone else's nightmare. That evening, Asher suggested they eat on the terrace. Moira brought up steak and salad, wine, and beneath a Manhattan sky glittering with lights instead of stars, because this city was too bright to let anyone see the stars. They truly talked for the first time. She told him about her mother, about the cancer that might have been cured if it had been found 6 months earlier, about the way she had sat beside her mother's bed in a public hospital holding her hand until that hand turned cold, and about the promise she had made to herself that she would become a nurse so that no one would have to die simply because they were poor, not if she could stop it. Asher listened without interrupting, his gray eyes softening in a way Felicity had never seen before. When she finished, he didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he took her hand, gently lifted it, and pressed his lips to the back of it, his mouth warm and dry against her skin, and said in a low, rough voice, "Thank you for reminding me who I used to be." Felicity didn't pull her hand away. She let it remain there in his, and felt the pulse in her wrist quicken. When she returned to her room that night, Felicity lay staring at the ceiling in the dark and realized that what she was feeling was no longer curiosity, but something far more dangerous. Because Asher Fontaine wasn't only the cold boss she had signed a contract with, he was a broken architect hiding an entire sky behind a concrete wall. And it was that brokenness that threatened her heart more than any gun in his world ever could. The 6th week began with a pounding December rain that turned the streets of Harlem into rivers, and Felicity was trapped in it for 40 minutes while running from the subway station to the clinic because she had given her only umbrella to an elderly patient waiting outside the door. That evening, she returned to the penthouse soaked through and chilled to the bone, and the next morning she woke with her throat burning, her head heavy as poured lead, and the thermometer reading 103 degrees. Moira forced her to stay in bed and called Asher, who was at his office in Tribeca. What happened next was something Felicity could hardly believe. Asher canceled a meeting with a crime boss from Chicago that, according to Reese, had been arranged 2 months earlier. When Felicity overheard Reese telling Moira on the phone that this had never happened once in the 20 years Asher had been in charge, she thought Reese was exaggerating, until Asher stepped into her room 30 minutes later, taking off his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his white shirt, and carrying a small tray with a steaming cup of ginger honey tea. "You didn't need to cancel the meeting," Felicity said, her voice rough and hoarse. "It's only a cold." Asher set the tray on the table beside the bed, pulled an armchair closer, sat down, and opened a hardback book he had brought from the reading room. "That can wait," he said without looking up. "Your health can't." And so for the next 3 days, Asher Fontaine, the boss who controlled half the underworld of the eastern United States, turned into a caretaker. Felicity never could have imagined. He brought ginger tea every morning, made sure she took her medicine on time, sat reading silently beside her bed for hours without a single complaint. And when Moira brought up porridge, Asher checked the temperature before letting Felicity eat, as though he trusted no one to do it properly but himself. On the second day, she protested that she was a nurse and fully capable of taking care of herself, and Asher looked at her with those unyielding gray eyes and replied, "Nurses take care of patients, who takes care of the nurse," then went back to reading, as though the argument had already ended. The third night was when everything changed. Her fever spiked in the middle of the night and brought with it a nightmare she hadn't had in years. She dreamed of her mother lying in a hospital bed, her hand cold in Felicity's grasp, and she was calling out, but no one came. No one came. No one ever came. She woke with a start in the darkness, sweat soaking through her nightshirt, her mouth calling a name that until that moment she hadn't realized she was calling. Asher. He appeared at her door within seconds, so quickly that she knew he either hadn't been sleeping at all or had been sleeping very near her room. But what stole Felicity's breath wasn't the speed. It was the way he came. Asher wasn't carrying his cane. He crossed the cold floor barefoot, limping openly, each drag of his right leg so painful that Felicity could see his jaw clench in the darkness. But he kept moving, until he reached her bedside without stopping. For the first time, Felicity saw Asher Fontaine without the cane, without the suit, without any armor at all. Only a man in a t-shirt and sleep pants walking painfully through a dark hallway because she had called his name. "What happened?" he asked, sitting down beside the bed, his voice rough with lost sleep but his eyes fully alert. "A nightmare," Felicity whispered, feeling foolish for being a grown woman frightened by a dream. "I'm sorry I woke you." Asher didn't answer right away. He only looked at her, and in the moonlight slipping through the curtains, Felicity saw his eyes soften in a way he would never have allowed in daylight. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked, "until you fall asleep again?" Felicity nodded, too exhausted to pretend to be strong. Asher pulled the armchair closer to the bed and sat down, and in the haze between fever and medicine, Felicity asked a question she never would have dared ask if she had been fully awake. "Have you ever loved anyone?" Asher was silent so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his voice came through the darkness, low and slow, as if each word had to pass through a wall before it could escape. "Yes," he said, "once, a long time ago, when I was still at Columbia, before everything changed." "What happened?" Felicity whispered, her eyes heavy but still fighting to stay open. "She left when I took over the empire," Asher said. "She told me she couldn't live in my world. She chose an ordinary life with an ordinary man, and I don't blame her because she was right." There was no bitterness in his voice, only the flatness Felicity was beginning to understand as the way Asher handled pain, turning it into objective fact, stripping out the emotion, placing it on a shelf like a book he had already finished reading. Felicity wanted to ask more, but sleep was already pulling her down, and the last thing she heard before sinking completely under was Asher's voice, low and soft as breath. "Sleep well, Felicity. You're safe." When she woke the next morning, the fever was completely gone, but Asher was no longer in the room. The armchair was still beside the bed, and the hollow in its cushion showed that someone had sat there for a very long time. And on the nightstand, beside the cold cup of tea from the night before, stood a small glass jar holding several fresh white flowers, along with a small card written in the familiar sharp script she knew so well. "So your room will smell like spring," signed A. Felicity picked up the card, her fingers tracing the ink, and for the first time since the day she entered this penthouse, she allowed herself to ask a question she knew would change everything if the answer was yes. Could this marriage become real? The 8th week brought the first test Felicity couldn't face alone, stepping out into the outside world as Asher Fontaine's wife. The New York Legal Aid Foundation's annual charity gala was being held at the Plaza Hotel, and Asher, as its largest sponsor and the polished legal face of the empire, couldn't be absent. "I need you to come with me," Asher said over dinner 2 days before the event, his tone not quite a command but not a request either. "People will want to meet my wife." That morning, Moira laid out on Felicity's bed a black dress that fell to her ankles, the silk soft as it traced the lines of her body, elegant without being showy, along with a pair of high heels and small pearl earrings. She didn't ask who had chosen it, but she guessed it wasn't Moira, because the dress fit as though someone had memorized every curve of her body without ever needing to measure. When Felicity came downstairs to the living room that evening, Asher was already standing by the front door waiting, dressed in a black three-piece suit, a silver gray tie, his hair perfectly combed, one hand resting on the silver head of his cane. And when he saw her descending the staircase, he stopped in the middle of the sentence he was exchanging with Reese over the phone. His gray eyes swept slowly from head to toe before lifting to hers, and Felicity caught the almost imperceptible nod that came with the only two words he said, "You look beautiful." Then he turned back and continued the conversation as if nothing had happened. But Felicity noticed that his fingers had tightened around the head of the cane. The plaza blazed with warm golden light, its grand ballroom crowded with the powerful faces of New York high society and the legal world. Champagne in every hand, polite laughter floating beneath gilded ceilings. Asher led her in with his hand resting lightly against the small of her back, close enough for the world to know she belonged with him, but light enough that she didn't feel possessed, and Felicity realized she hated the fact that the touch made her feel safe, instead of uneasy. The whispers began the moment they crossed the threshold, curious eyes sweeping over her from head to toe, false smiles hiding the real questions underneath. The first to strike was Paige Whitford. She appeared as if she had been waiting for the perfect moment. 36 years old, with sharply cropped platinum blonde hair, a fitted red gown, a diamond necklace glimmering beneath the lights, and a smile that spread wide, while her eyes stayed cold as knives. Paige was the chief legal advisor to the Fontaine Empire, and from the way she stood a little too close to Asher when she extended her hand, Felicity understood at once that whatever had existed between them hadn't been only business. Asher introduced Felicity, and Paige clasped her hand just tightly enough to send a message, before offering a smile sweet enough to sting. "What a surprise," Paige said, her eyes never leaving Felicity's face. "Asher has always said marriage is an institution for people who lack imagination. How did you change his mind? Or with what?" Felicity felt Asher go rigid beside her, but before he could speak, she smiled calmly. "Maybe he only needed to meet the right person," Felicity said, her voice gentle but her gaze fixed on Paige without blinking. "I'm sure you understand that, Paige. Or maybe that's something you've never experienced." Paige's smile froze at the edges before she excused herself to greet other guests, but the look she cast over her shoulder held something Felicity noticed immediately. Not just jealousy, but calculation. 10 minutes later, a tall man approached them, around 42, with neatly combed brown hair, a broad politician's smile, and an expensive navy suit. And when he shook Asher's hand, the air around them thickened like the sky before a storm. "Byron Shaw," Asher said, his voice so polite that Felicity instantly heard the danger beneath it. "This is my wife, Felicity." Byron took her hand, his grip warm but lingering a little too long, and his eyes settled on her with an intensity Felicity recognized at once as something other than admiration. He was assessing her, as though deciding whether she was a pawn or a queen on the board. He offered his congratulations and disappeared back into the crowd. But Felicity could feel that gaze clinging to her for the rest of the evening, and Asher's hand at her back tightened slightly after that encounter. The moment everything peaked came near the end of the night, when an older woman, clearly drunk on too much champagne, stepped into their path in the middle of the ballroom. "Asher Fontaine?" she said loudly enough for the surrounding guests to turn and look. "Manhattan's crippled crime lord. Did this little thing marry you for your money, or out of pity for that leg?" Silence spread through the room like spilled oil. Felicity saw the pain flash in Asher's eyes as quickly as lightning, before the familiar mask of stone dropped back into place, and rage surged through her so fiercely that she stepped in front of him without thinking. "You are completely mistaken," Felicity said, her voice calm but every word as sharp as a surgical blade. "Truly strong men don't need to prove their strength to an entire room. They save it for the people who deserve it, and I can assure you that my husband is stronger than anyone standing here tonight." The woman opened her mouth to answer, but Felicity wasn't done. "And if you want to insult my husband," she said, taking one more step toward her, "at least wait until you're sober enough to stand steadily in your own shoes." The woman recoiled, muttered something under her breath, and vanished into the crowd. And when Felicity turned back, Asher was looking at her with gray eyes she couldn't read, though something inside them was trembling. They didn't speak again until they were seated in the black Mercedes on the way home, Manhattan drifting past the windows like a river of light. No one has ever done that for me, Asher said, his voice rough, not looking at her but out through the glass. No one has ever defended me before. Felicity turned to him, seeing the sharp line of his jaw in the passing wash of streetlights, and said in a voice that startled even her because it was so honest it frightened her, "Now you have someone." Asher turned to look at her, and in that moment, when their eyes met inside the dark car, Felicity realized that tonight she hadn't been acting at all. She had defended him because she wanted to. She had called him my husband, and the words had rested on her tongue with the weight of a vow. But the question she didn't dare speak aloud hung between them in the silence. If this was no longer pretend, then when had it become real? In the weeks after the gala night, something between Felicity and Asher began to shift, in a way they both felt, but neither dared to name. It started with small things. Every morning before he left the penthouse, Felicity slipped notes into Asher's black leather document case, sometimes reminding him to eat lunch because she knew he'd forget, sometimes quoting a line from the architecture book she had found in the reading room, sometimes simply leaving a short joke she knew would make him laugh to himself in the middle of a mountain of files. Asher never said anything about those little slips of paper, but she knew he read them, because one afternoon, she saw one folded carefully inside the drawer of his desk. And the following week, flowers began appearing at the Harlem Clinic, not showy red roses, but small bundles of wildflowers wrapped in brown paper, with no card and no name, though her colleague, June Calloway, looked at Felicity with wide eyes and said the delivery man had arrived in a black Mercedes. Then came the night at Blue Note. Asher bought tickets to a jazz performance without warning, only saying that he had 2 tickets, and asking whether she wanted to go in the same ordinary tone he might have used to ask what she wanted for dinner. The club was small and warm in Greenwich Village, the lights dim, the saxophone pouring through the crowded room like honey, and they sat at a corner table, shoulder touching shoulder in the dark. In the middle of the 3rd song, when the piano sank into low aching notes, Asher took her hand. He didn't ask, didn't look at her, only laid his warm hand over hers on the table and laced his fingers through hers as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And Felicity didn't pull away because it was natural. Terrifying as that was, it was natural. On the drive home, Felicity leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes, not because she was sleepy, but because she wanted to know what Asher would do when he thought she couldn't see. She felt the car stop in front of the penthouse, heard the engine go quiet, and then the silence stretched on. After that, his fingers touched her cheek, light as almost nothing, gliding along the line of her cheekbone down to her chin, and his voice whispered so softly that she almost didn't hear it. "Felicity, what are you doing to me?" She kept her eyes closed, her heart beating wildly inside her chest, and she knew then that she was falling, not slowly, but that she had fallen long ago and was only now willing to admit it. But what Felicity wouldn't admit even to herself was that her body was sending signals she was deliberately ignoring. The nausea every morning that she blamed on coffee brewed too strong, the bone-deep exhaustion she blamed on working 2 shifts in a row, the dizziness she blamed on lack of sleep, until she couldn't ignore it any longer. That day, she was taking a patient's blood pressure at the Harlem Clinic when the room began to spin, the floor tilted beneath her, and the last thing she heard before the world went black was June shouting her name. She woke in the clinic's medical room, her vision blurred with fluorescent ceiling lights overhead and the worried face of the attending doctor above her. Before she could say anything, the door burst open, and Asher Fontaine walked in like a contained storm. His face drained white, his gray eyes nearly black, his hand gripping the cane so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. June later told her that he had arrived within 15 minutes of receiving the call, had stormed past reception without stopping, and when a security guard blocked him in the hallway, he had said only one sentence in a voice that, according to June, made her understand for the first time why people were afraid of Asher Fontaine. "My wife is in there, and if you don't step aside, I'll step through you." The doctor said she was exhausted, dehydrated, and needed complete rest for at least a week. Felicity nodded and said it was work stress, irregular meals, too many late nights, and she felt the lie sitting heavy on her tongue because she knew the real cause wasn't that at all, but that truth would destroy everything. So she swallowed it down along with the rising nausea. Asher said nothing on the drive home, wrapped in the same dense silence she had seen after the gala. But this time it was heavier, darker. That night she couldn't sleep and went up to the penthouse rooftop, where January moonlight spread over Manhattan like liquid silver, and found Asher already there, sitting in an iron chair facing the city, his cane resting beside him, his shoulders slightly bowed. He heard her footsteps and spoke without turning around. 20 minutes. Felicity sat down in the chair beside him. 20 minutes what? 20 minutes from the moment I got the call to the moment I saw you lying in that clinic bed, Asher said, his voice flat as the surface of a frozen lake, though she could hear the fracture beneath it. And during those 20 minutes, I thought of every worst possibility. I thought I'd lost you. And that thought frightened me more than any bullet I've ever faced. Felicity felt her chest tighten. Asher, she said softly, I know what our arrangement is, he continued, still looking out over the city. I know this was supposed to be a contract, but I can't pretend anymore that it's still only a contract, because contracts don't make people fear losing their partner so badly they can't breathe. It's the same for me, Felicity whispered. It stopped being only a contract a long time ago. Silence stretched between them in the cold January air, and Felicity felt that moment hanging there as though they were standing on the edge of a cliff. One more step, and they would both fall into each other. But Asher stood up. He took his cane and didn't look at her. You should go to bed, he said, his voice already pulling that familiar wall back into place. You need to rest. Then he walked away, the steady tap of his cane striking the rooftop floor until it vanished behind the glass door, leaving Felicity sitting alone beneath the moonlight, with her heart breaking inside her chest, and the familiar nausea rising into her throat, because she had just confessed her feelings to the man who ran the moment he heard her answer, and the secret of the baby growing inside her would turn everything that was already complicated into something impossible to save once Asher Fontaine found out. Week 11 began with the worst wave of nausea Felicity had ever endured, and she had to cling to the bathroom sink for 10 full minutes before she could step out to breakfast with Asher and pretend that everything was normal. Since the night on the rooftop, neither of them had mentioned that confession again. Asher had retreated behind his familiar wall of polished courtesy, and Felicity didn't push because she was hiding something far greater than her feelings, but her body was refusing to cooperate with her plan to stay silent. She was growing visibly thinner, the shadows beneath her eyes deepening by the day. And every afternoon at the Harlem clinic, she had to sit down between patients because dizziness came over her without warning. June Calloway looked at her with concern and asked whether she needed to see a doctor, but Felicity shook her head and said she still hadn't fully recovered from the last time she fainted, and by now the lie had become a snowball rolling downhill that she couldn't stop. That day she was entering patient records into the computer when the room began to spin. Not the light dizziness she had felt before, but the entire world, tilting 90 degrees, the ringing in her ears swallowing every other sound, and she slid from her chair onto the floor. This time no one caught her in time. Her head struck the corner of the desk before it hit the ground, and by the time June ran to her, Felicity was completely unconscious, blood seeping from the cut on her forehead. The ambulance took her to Mount Sinai in 12 minutes, but by the time her stretcher was pushed through the emergency room doors, Asher Fontaine was already there, his suit rumpled, his hair fallen out of place, his hand gripping his cane so tightly it had gone white, his gray eyes black with a wildness so stark that the hospital staff stepped aside without being told. Felicity woke beneath the harsh white glare of fluorescent lights, with the sharp sting of antiseptic in the air, pain throbbing in her head where the cut had already been bandaged, and the first thing she saw was Asher sitting in the chair beside her bed, his face like stone, but his eyes were not. His eyes held something she had never seen there before, real fear. Before she could open her mouth to say anything at all, the door to the room opened, and a female doctor walked in holding a chart. Her eyes lowered to the file before she looked up with a professional smile. Mrs. Fontaine, the doctor said. The good news is that the cut on your forehead doesn't need stitches, and there are no signs of cranial trauma, but we need to do an ultrasound, because the fetus in the early second trimester can still be sensitive to a fall like this, and we want to make sure the baby is completely fine. The world stopped. Felicity felt every word drop into the room with the weight of concrete, and she didn't need to turn her head to know that everything was over, because the silence coming from the chair beside her bed wasn't ordinary silence, but the kind that comes before a building collapses. She turned to look at Asher. He sat perfectly still, one hand still resting on the head of the cane, his face expressionless in the way Felicity knew was most dangerous, because it meant every emotion inside him was detonating but nothing was allowed to escape. His gray eyes stared straight at the opposite wall, not at her, not at the doctor, not at anything at all. Asher, Felicity whispered, her voice breaking. I can explain. He stood up, slowly, with control, took his cane, and walked out of the room without saying a word. He didn't turn back. He didn't slam the door. He simply walked away, and that silence was crueler than anything he could have said. Felicity called his name, but the door had already closed, and she heard the sound of his cane striking the hospital hallway farther and farther away until it disappeared completely. And then she cried in a way she hadn't cried since the night her mother died. Cried because she knew she had just destroyed the only thing in her life that had ever truly mattered. 20 minutes later, Rhys Fontaine walked into the room, his sharply cut face giving nothing away, but his eyes paused on the tear tracks on Felicity's cheeks before he sat down in the chair Asher had just left. "He's gone," Felicity said, her voice hoarse. Rhys nodded. "He called me from the car and told me to come here to you." Felicity closed her eyes, and tears slid back into her hair. "You have to understand," Rhys said, his voice low and careful, as if he were trying to diffuse a mine. His mother left when he was 9, without an explanation, without ever coming back, and he waited for her at the school gate every day for a year, until he finally understood she wasn't coming. His father was killed by the very ally he trusted most when he was 16. Everyone Asher has ever trusted either left or betrayed him. Rhys paused and looked directly into Felicity's eyes. "You were the first person he trusted after all of that. The first person he let into his home. The first person he let get close. And you hid something from him too." Felicity wanted to scream that she hadn't betrayed him, that her circumstances hadn't given her any choice, but instead she told the truth, all of it, in a trembling voice that kept breaking apart. The baby wasn't Asher's. It belonged to her ex, the man who had left her the moment he found out she was pregnant, disappearing just as her father had disappeared, and when she signed the marriage contract with Asher, she had already been 5 weeks pregnant, but she hid it because she was afraid he would cancel the agreement, afraid the debt would return, afraid of losing the only shelter she had, afraid because she had no one in this world except the baby in her womb, and the job she was trying to hold on to with her own 2 bare hands. Rhys listened without interrupting, his face unchanged, and when she finished, he sat in silence for a long time before standing up. "I understand why you hid it," he said, "but he needs to hear these things from you, not from me, and I don't know whether he's ready to listen, but if there's anyone in this world who can still reach him right now, it's you." Rhys left, and Felicity lay alone in the stark white hospital room, her hand resting unconsciously over her stomach, where the baby she had tried to hide from the whole world was growing, and the only question turning over and over in her mind so relentlessly that she could barely breathe was whether a man who had been abandoned by everyone he had ever loved could forgive this kind of secrecy, no matter what reason lay behind it. 3 days after leaving Mount Sinai Hospital, Felicity was living in a penthouse that had turned into a block of ice. Asher hadn't disappeared. He was still there every morning and every evening, still sitting at the dining table on time, still asking whether she needed anything. But his voice was flat as the surface of glass, his eyes looking through her as though she were a window, and the distance between them, though only a table apart, stretched wider than any ocean. He treated her like a guest being received with flawless care, but with no real connection. Perfectly polite and utterly cold, and that politeness was crueler than anger ever could have been, because anger would at least have proved that he still cared. Moira was the first person to speak plainly to Felicity. On the morning of the second day, she brought ginger tea up to her room because Felicity still hadn't dared to come down and eat breakfast with Asher, and then sat on the edge of the bed with eyes that were both stern and gentle. "He is the smartest fool I've ever known in my life," Moira said, "and I've served the Fontaine family for 20 years, so I know what I'm talking about." Felicity looked at her, her eyes swollen from crying. "You are the first person he's ever brought into this house," Moira continued, her voice soft but every word carrying weight. "Not as a guest or a business partner, or any of the things he tells himself to justify it, but truly into his home, to sit at his table, to step into his reading room, to touch the sketchbooks that even Rhys has never been allowed to open. He's terrified, darling. Terrified because you're the first person who has truly had the power to hurt him." Felicity swallowed her tears and thanked Moira, but by the 3rd day she couldn't bear it any longer. That night, when Asher went into his study after a dinner they had both eaten in suffocating silence early, Felicity followed him and shut the door behind her. Asher was standing beside the desk, his hand just setting down his briefcase, and when he turned and saw her leaning against the closed door, he stopped. "Felicity," he said, his voice still carrying that frozen politeness of the past 3 days. "I'm busy. I don't care," she answered, and the false calm she had tried to maintain for 3 days shattered all at once. "You can't treat me like a stranger, hide behind a pile of paperwork, and call that being busy. You owe me a real conversation whether you want one or not." Asher's eyes darkened. "I don't owe you anything," he said, his voice still controlled, but Felicity heard the crack beneath it. "You're the one who hid things from me, remember?" Felicity stepped closer. "Yes, I hid it. I hid it because I was afraid of losing everything. Just like you hide your leg from the world because you're afraid they'll see you as weak, just like you hide those architecture sketchbooks, because you're afraid people will know you still know how to dream. We both hide the things that make us most vulnerable. The difference is that I'm standing here ready to admit it, and you're running." That struck home, and Felicity saw Asher's jaw clench, saw the hand gripping the head of the cane tighten until the tendons rose white beneath the skin. "You don't understand," he said, his voice suddenly dropping lower, rougher. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Then explain it to me," Felicity almost shouted. "Don't treat me like I'm too young or too naive to hear the truth." And Asher broke. Not loudly. There was no shouting. It was the kind of breaking that happens when a dam cracks from the inside, slow and unstoppable. "My mother left when I was 9, he said, each word sounding as though it had to be dragged out with metal hooks. "She sent me to boarding school in Connecticut and never came back. I waited for her every holiday, every birthday, every Christmas. Every time there was an excuse, work, illness, a trip, always some excuse, until I finally understood that the only real reason was that she didn't want me." He stopped, took a breath, and Felicity saw his shoulders tremble, though his voice remained terrifyingly calm. "My father was killed when I was 16, by the man he trusted like a brother, his closest ally, who put a knife in his back, and I had to leave Columbia, leave behind everything I had ever wanted, just to keep Reese and everyone who depended on the Fontaine family from being swallowed whole." Asher looked at her, and Felicity saw deep in those gray eyes the thing he had hidden more carefully than any physical weakness. "I built this empire not because I wanted power," he said, "but because if I was strong enough, then no one would ever be able to leave me again. No one would be able to come close, and then disappear carrying a piece of me with them when they went. But you already took nearly all of me before I even knew how to stop it." Felicity felt tears running down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. "I love you," she said, her voice breaking but unwavering. "I love you. Not the contract, not the penthouse, not the erased debt. I love the man who draws hospitals at 3 a.m. and reads architecture books in the dark, and came running to my room without his cane when I called his name." Asher closed his eyes as though her words caused him physical pain. "My world kills people, Felicity," he said. "Byron Shaw looked at you at the gala the way a predator looks at prey. Did you see that? If I keep you beside me, sooner or later that world will touch you. Keeping you close means killing you. Do you understand that?" Felicity looked at him, at the man pushing her away because he was terrified of dragging her into danger, at the man destroying the only beautiful thing in his life because he believed he didn't deserve to keep it, and she felt her heart hurt and burn with anger so fiercely she could barely breathe. "The difference between us, Asher," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "is that I am willing to risk being hurt for the chance to be happy, while you choose guaranteed misery, just to avoid the possibility of pain." Then she turned, opened the door, and walked out. She went upstairs, packed the small suitcase with exactly the things she had brought with her on the first day, called June Calloway, and said she needed a place to stay for a while, and went down to the lobby without looking back. Moira was standing in the hallway, her eyes red with tears, but she didn't try to stop her. She only held Felicity for a moment, and said in a broken voice that she would always have a place there. Felicity stepped into the elevator, and before the doors closed, she listened, waiting, hoping to hear the rapid strike of a cane across the marble floor, hoping to hear Asher call her name, hoping for any sign at all that he was coming after her. But the penthouse remained completely silent. No cane sounded behind her. He let her go. 3 days after leaving the penthouse, Felicity lay on the pull-out sofa bed in June Calloway's one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, her eyes fixed on the cracked plaster ceiling as she wondered why this ceiling felt more familiar than the penthouse ceiling, even though she had lived there for nearly 3 months. June didn't ask many questions. She simply made tea, laid out an extra blanket, and looked at Felicity with worried eyes each time she ran to the bathroom to vomit in the morning. The only message from the penthouse came through Moira, her voice calm over the phone, though Felicity could hear the sadness beneath it. "Mr. Fontaine says he respects your decision and won't trouble you anymore." "Respects your decision," Felicity repeated in her mind. That clean, sterile language people used to say he had given up, that she had been right when she told him he would choose misery over risk. What Felicity didn't know was that while she lay on a sofa in Brooklyn, on the 40th floor of the legal tower in Tribeca, Paige Whitford was making the move she had been calculating ever since the gala night at the plaza. Paige knew Felicity had left the penthouse because Moira had mentioned it by accident during a work call, and with the jealousy she had swallowed for 3 months now boiling over into action, Paige picked up the phone and called the man she knew would pay the highest price for that information. Byron Shaw. "Fontaine's wife has left the penthouse," Paige said, her voice flat as if she were reporting a contract clause. "She's in Brooklyn. No protection. No one with her. If you want to send Asher a message, this is the time." That afternoon, Felicity left the Harlem clinic later than usual because one patient needed extra care, and by the time she walked down the quiet Brooklyn street leading back to June's apartment, it was already dark, the streetlights flickering weakly above wet sidewalks after the afternoon rain. She didn't hear the black SUV until it screeched to a stop beside her. The door flew open, and 2 large men jumped out so quickly that before Felicity could scream, one hand was already covering her mouth, another was wrenching her arm behind her back, and within seconds, she was dragged into the vehicle, blindfolded with black cloth. Her wrists cinched tight with plastic ties so hard she could feel her pulse jerking beneath her skin. The car drove for about 20 minutes. Felicity counted every turn, trying to control her breathing because panic at a moment like this meant death, and she reminded herself that she wasn't only protecting herself but also the baby in her womb. When the blindfold was removed, she was sitting on a wooden chair in the middle of an empty concrete warehouse in Red Hook. The smell of engine oil and seawater tangled in the cold, damp air, industrial lights hanging high above and casting a sickly yellow glow across the cracked concrete floor. Byron Shaw stood in front of her, his hands in his trouser pockets, his smile as wide as it had been on gala night, but this time there was no layer of politeness covering it, only naked cruelty. "Mrs. Fontaine," Byron said, his voice gentle as though he were inviting her to tea. "Or should I call you Miss Brennan? Because from what I understand, this marriage isn't exactly about love." Felicity didn't answer. She looked straight into his eyes and kept her face calm, even though her heart was pounding so hard it felt ready to break through her ribs. Byron pulled out his phone, dialed a number, switched it to speaker, and when Asher's voice echoed through the warehouse, Felicity felt her entire body tremble, not from fear, but from relief at hearing him. "Shaw," Asher said, and his voice was so cold, the air inside the warehouse seemed to drop several more degrees. Byron laughed. "Fontaine, I have something that belongs to you, or more accurately, something you threw away. Hand Brooklyn and Queens over to me, and I'll return her untouched. Otherwise, she'll lose more than a marriage." Silence stretched for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Felicity heard something Byron didn't, because he didn't know Asher the way she did. His voice shook, not from fear for himself, but from fear for her, a slight tremor at the end of the sentence that only someone who had heard him whisper in the dark would have recognized. "If a single hair on her head is harmed," Asher said, each word slow and precise like the cut of a surgical blade, "I won't only take back what's mine, I'll take everything you have, including your last breath." Byron ended the call still smiling, but Felicity could see that the smile no longer sat easily on his face. 40 minutes later, the iron warehouse door burst open. Felicity heard chaos, shouts, pounding footsteps, and then the sound she knew more intimately than almost any other, the tap of a cane on concrete, slow, steady, unhurried, dangerous. Asher stepped through the doorway, the silver-headed cane in his right hand, a black handgun in his left, held alongside his body as calmly as if he were carrying a pen, his suit wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his gray eyes burning with a fire Felicity had never seen before. Reese's men had already subdued Byron's people outside, but Asher came in alone, and when Byron watched him limp over the threshold, he blurted out, "You came yourself, with that leg." Asher didn't stop walking. "This leg is enough to take me anywhere she is," he said, then stepped past Byron as though stepping past an object and went straight to Felicity. He set the gun down on the floor, dropped to his knees despite the pain written clearly across his face when his knee struck the cold concrete, and untied her wrists with fingers Felicity realized were trembling. When the last tie fell away from her skin, Felicity lifted her eyes to his face, and saw the one thing she had never thought she would see on Asher Fontaine's face. Tears, not falling in streams, but gathered at the rim of his gray eyes, glittering beneath the industrial lights, and he didn't even try to hide them. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice completely broken now. No control left, no wall left, nothing except a man stripped bare by fear. "I thought you'd die believing I didn't love you, when loving you is the only thing that's kept me alive." Felicity lifted both hands to his face, wiped away his tears with her thumbs, feeling his skin hot and damp beneath her palms, and said in a whisper that was steadier than anything she had ever spoken, "Then don't be afraid anymore, and let me love you." Asher closed his eyes, rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her lips, and in that moment, in the middle of a freezing concrete warehouse in Red Hook, thick with the smell of oil and seawater, the two of them clung to each other like the last broken pieces in the world that had somehow found one another. But Felicity knew there was still truth left unspoken, the identity of the baby's father, and why she had remained silent, and this time she wouldn't hold back anymore, because this time she would let him see her completely, even if that meant losing him all over again. The ambulance took Felicity to Mount Sinai for the second time in less than 2 weeks, this time because of the bruises on her wrists from the restraints and the psychological shock after the kidnapping, and the doctors wanted to keep her overnight to monitor both her and the fetus. Asher didn't leave her hospital room. He sat in the plastic chair beside her bed, his hand holding hers, his cane leaning against the wall, and he didn't let go even when the nurse came in to check her vital signs, even when Reese called to say that Byron Shaw had been handed over to be dealt with, even when the clock on the wall crept past midnight, and then 1 o'clock, and then 2 in the morning. Felicity lay still, listening to the steady beeping of the heart monitor, and feeling Asher's thumb trace small circles over the back of her hand, slow and unconscious, as if he were trying to reassure himself that she was still here. At around 3 in the morning, when the hospital had sunk into that heavy silence broken only by the faint buzz of fluorescent lights, Felicity gave his hand a gentle squeeze and said, "I need to tell you everything, and this time I won't hide anything." Asher didn't say a word. He only looked at her and waited, and Felicity began. She told him about the man before him, without saying his name because that name didn't deserve to exist inside this room, and she said that she had loved him with the innocent kind of love that belongs to someone who hasn't yet been hurt, that when the pregnancy test showed 2 lines she had called him with a heart full of hope, and that he had gone silent for 10 seconds on the phone before saying that it wasn't his problem, then hung up and changed his number. She told Asher that when she signed the marriage contract, she had already been 5 weeks pregnant, that she hid it because if he had known, the agreement would have fallen apart, the debt would have returned, she would have lost the only roof over her head, lost the only protection she had, and been left to raise a child alone in a damp studio in Brooklyn on $3,200 a month, while nearly $3 million in debt hung over her like a blade. She spoke without crying because her tears had run dry 3 days earlier, and her voice was flat and truthful in a way that felt almost merciless. "The baby isn't yours," she said, looking straight into Asher's eyes beneath the pale white hospital lights. "But it's my child, and I'm not sorry for wanting to protect it with every means I had, even if that meant lying to the only person who ever treated me with kindness." Asher was silent for so long that Felicity could hear each beat of her own heart on the monitor, and she braced herself for the moment when he would let go of her hand, stand up, and walk away again. But instead, Asher did something she would never forget for the rest of her life. He rose from the chair slowly because he didn't have his cane, sat down on the edge of the hospital bed, and placed his right hand on her stomach, gently, trembling, his warm palm resting over the thin fabric of the hospital gown, right where the baby lay. "Any child of yours," Asher said, his voice low and broken, "is mine too, if you'll allow it." Felicity felt something inside her chest shatter, not in the painful way things break, but in the way the last wall collapses and light pours into the darkest place, and she cried without control, cried from relief and gratitude and love, and because this man, who had been abandoned by everyone he had ever trusted, had just chosen to embrace a child that wasn't his by blood simply because it was hers. Asher watched her cry, and for the first time since the night his father died, tears ran down his face. Not just a few gathered at the edge of his eyes like in the warehouse, but real tears, down his sharp cheekbones, down his jaw, falling onto her hand on the hospital bed. "I love you," he said, each word heavy as though he were lifting stone. I love you so much that it terrifies me, because I've never had anything worth losing until I had you." "Then don't be afraid anymore," Felicity whispered, taking the hand he had placed on her stomach, "and let me love you." Asher bent down and kissed her. Their first real kiss. Not a kiss on the cheek close to her mouth like at the wedding, not a polite kiss on the hand like on the nights before, but lips on lips, slow, deep, trembling, the salt of both their tears mingling together, and Felicity felt like someone who had been drowning underwater for months and had only just broken the surface to breathe. When they parted, their foreheads resting together, their breaths mingling, Asher said in a voice gone rough with emotion, "I'm not perfect, Felicity. I limp. I have a past stained with blood. I have nightmares every night, and I've spent my whole life building walls to push everyone away." Felicity laid her hand on his chest, right over the heart beating fast beneath her palm. "I don't need perfect," she said. "I need you." Asher closed his eyes, his hand still resting on her stomach, and for the first time since Felicity had walked into the penthouse 3 months earlier, they truly touched each other, with no contract, no walls, no secrets, just two broken people holding one another in a hospital room at 3 a.m. But even as Felicity drifted into sleep with his hand still warm against her stomach, one small part of her still whispered the question she didn't dare ask out loud. When morning came, and sunlight poured in, and the real world returned, would he run again? Felicity returned to the penthouse in the 14th week, not with the small suitcase she had carried the first time, but with Asher's hand holding hers through the entire drive home from the hospital, their fingers laced together as naturally as if they had always belonged in that place. Asher moved her into the suite beside his own, the blue and white room with the connecting door between them that had once always been shut now left slightly open, a small detail. But Felicity understood exactly what it meant. He wanted her closer even though he still didn't know how to say it aloud. The days that followed brought a growing closeness that both of them felt, but with the caution of people walking across broken glass. At night, they sat on the sofa in the living room talking until late, shoulder against shoulder, knee against knee. And Asher began reading architecture books out loud to her before she slept, his deep voice lulling her into a feeling of safety stronger than any lock. One night she woke to the sound of a strangled groan from the next room, opened the connecting door, and found Asher curled on the bed, sweat drenching his forehead, trapped in a nightmare. She climbed onto the bed beside him, laid her hand on his chest, and whispered his name until his breathing evened out and, still in sleep, his hand found hers and held on tightly. The next morning, neither of them mentioned it. But the following night, the connecting door stood open wider. Then, that night came. Felicity was reading in bed when she heard a soft knock at the connecting door. So soft she almost thought she had imagined it. "Can I stay?" Asher's voice came from the other side, low and hesitant in a way she had never heard from a man who controlled everything. Felicity didn't answer with words. She closed the book, set it on the bedside table, and pulled the blanket back on one side. Asher stepped in, and for the first time, Felicity saw him with no armor at all. No cane, no suit, no shirt buttoned high at the throat, only sleep pants and a thin t-shirt, barefoot on the wooden floor. And when he sat on the edge of the bed, the lamplight fell across his right leg, the long surgical scars running from knee to thigh, the skin twisted and discolored where the bullet fragments had been removed, and the bone had been pinned back together, ugly and real. And he didn't hide it. Felicity sat up, reached out, and touched the longest scar, her fingers moving slowly along it, and she felt Asher stop breathing beneath her hand. She didn't say anything because she didn't need to. She only bent down and pressed her lips to the scar, gently, and she heard him let out a shaking breath, as if someone had just loosened the last wire holding him together. That night they made love for the first time, and it wasn't anything like what Felicity had once imagined because it wasn't perfect. Asher moved slowly because of the pain in his leg, and there were moments when he had to stop and grit his teeth through it. But his hands touched her as if she were the most sacred thing he had ever been allowed to hold, and she touched his scars not with pity but with love, with a wordless promise that every part of him belonged to her, even the parts he hated most. But the next morning Felicity woke in an empty bed. Her hand moved across the other side, the sheets already cold, and on the pillow lay a folded note written in the sharp, clean script she recognized even through sleepy eyes. "Last night was a mistake. It can't happen again. You deserve more than this." Signed A. Felicity read the note twice, then 3 times. and instead of crying the way he had probably expected her to, she felt anger rise in her chest, fiercer than any pain. She carried the note downstairs to the kitchen, where Moira was making coffee, and laid it on the table in front of her. Moira read it, sighed, looked up at the ceiling as if in prayer, and said, "The smartest fool in the world." But this time, Felicity didn't pack a suitcase. This time she didn't run, because last time she had run and nearly died in that warehouse in Red Hook, and she had promised herself in the hospital room that she would never again let his fear drive her away. She waited for Asher all day. He hid at the Tribeca office until late evening, and when he stepped into the study in the penthouse, Felicity was already sitting in the leather chair across from the desk, the very chair where she had sat on the first day she met him 3 months earlier. Asher stopped in the doorway, his gray eyes finding her, and Felicity saw his shoulders go rigid. Before he could open his mouth and speak one of those cold, polite sentences, Felicity said, "I'm not going anywhere. Last time I left and I almost died in Red Hook. This time I'm here, in this chair. And if you want me gone, then you look me in the eyes and tell me plainly that you don't love me. If you can say that, I'll leave right now and never come back." Asher stood motionless in the doorway, his hand gripping the cane, his jaw clenched, and Felicity waited, her heart pounding hard enough to break, but her eyes never leaving his, waiting for him to say those 4 words, "I don't love you." But he didn't say them. 10 seconds passed, then 20, then 30, and Asher Fontaine, the man who could order a killing without changing expression, couldn't say those 4 words because they were the one lie he wasn't capable of speaking. His silence was the answer, and Felicity stood and walked toward him. "You have a world of blood," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "But you also have that sketchbook full of hospitals. You have the drawings of the community theater. You have the dream from Columbia that you've buried for 20 years. Which one do you choose, Asher? Because my child and I will not live in a world where bullets are language and kidnapping is a negotiation tactic. I love you, but I love this baby more, and I'll protect it at any cost, even if that cost is losing you." Asher looked at her, and what Felicity saw in those gray eyes wasn't anger or resistance, but something close to exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting himself for too long and knew he was losing. He didn't answer that night. He only gave one slow nod, as if he were absorbing every word she had said, then stepped past her into the study and closed the door. Felicity went back to her room and lay down on the bed without knowing whether she should hope or prepare for the worst. But the next morning, when she woke at 6 and went downstairs looking for coffee, she stopped at the door of the study because the light was still on from the night before. She pushed the door open and saw Asher sitting at the desk, still wearing yesterday's suit, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled, and in front of him there were no business files and no maps of territory, but the old brown leather sketchbook, open, and in his hand a black ink pen moving across the page, drawing new architectural lines onto blank paper. And Felicity didn't need him to say anything out loud, because that drawing was the answer. In the weeks that followed, Asher disappeared into work in a way that was entirely different from before, not to avoid her, but because he was rebuilding everything from the foundation up, and Felicity knew it even though he didn't say much, because the signs were everywhere. Midnight calls with a new lawyer, not Paige Whitford, because after Reese traced the leak and discovered that Paige was the one who had fed information to Byron Shaw and led to the kidnapping, she was removed from every operation of the Empire within 24 hours, replaced instead by a federal attorney Felicity had never seen in person, but whose voice she often heard through the closed door of the study. Long meetings with Reese that stretched until 3 or 4 in the morning, the voices of the 2 brothers low and taut, and every now and then Felicity would hear Reese's voice rise and Asher's drop lower, calm but unyielding. Thick files spread across the desk, stamped with FBI markings, which Felicity caught a glimpse of one late night when she brought him coffee. She didn't ask because she trusted that he would tell her when he was ready, and that trust, after everything they had been through, was the most precious thing she could give him. On a weekend afternoon in the 17th week, Felicity was treating a patient at the Harlem clinic when June knocked on the door and said someone was there to see her. She stepped out into the hallway and found Reese Fontaine standing there, looking completely out of place in his expensive black coat, among the peeling painted walls and plastic chairs where patients waited to be seen. Reese wasn't a man who liked to speak in circles, so he went straight to the point. "He's dismantling everything, Felicity," Reese said, his voice steady, but his eyes holding something close to respect. "He's negotiating with the FBI, Trading everything he knows about Byron Shaw and the network in exchange for immunity, he's transferring the legal side of the empire to me to run, and taking apart the underground side. All of it. For you. Felicity felt her legs weaken and had to steady herself against the hallway wall. Reese handed her a large brown envelope. He told me to give you this. Felicity opened the envelope with trembling hands, and inside was an architectural drawing. Not one of the old drawings from the brown leather sketchbook, but a new one. Sharp black ink across white drafting paper. A 2-story building crowned with a glass dome to welcome natural light. A clinic on the ground floor. Counseling rooms upstairs. A healing garden in the back. And in the lower right corner, written in Asher's familiar hand, the project name, Brennan Community Health Center. Felicity looked at that name and had to press her hand over her mouth because a broken sound rose out of her before she could stop it. He said this is what he should have built 20 years ago, Reese said softly. And you're the one who reminded him. Felicity didn't remember whether she thanked Reese or not. Didn't remember what she said to June. She only remembered that 20 minutes later, she was in a taxi racing through Manhattan, with the drawing clutched tightly in her hand, and her heart beating so hard it nearly choked her. When she stepped out of the elevator onto the penthouse floor, Moira was standing in the foyer looking at her with wet eyes and the widest smile Felicity had ever seen on her face. He's up on the roof, Moira said. Felicity climbed the stairs to the rooftop and found Asher standing at the railing, looking out over Manhattan, his back to her, and she realized at once that he wasn't holding his cane. He was standing on his own 2 legs, leaning slightly to the left to take pressure off his right leg, the pain visible in the way his shoulders were set. But he stood there anyway, not hiding, not covering it up, accepting it. I'm home, she said. Asher turned around, and Felicity saw that his eyes were red. Not red because he was crying now, but red because he had cried before and hadn't bothered to hide it. He looked at the drawing in her hand, then at her eyes. It will take time, he said, his voice rough but steady. It will be dangerous. The FBI isn't an easy partner, and the people in the network won't be pleased when they learn I'm tearing it all down, but I want to be worthy of you, of our child too. And if that means burning everything I built over 20 years to the ground, then I'll burn it. Felicity stepped up to him, set the drawing down on the iron table beside the railing, then placed both hands on his chest. You've always been worthy, she said, looking straight into gray eyes that were no longer cold, but wet and warm and afraid and hopeful all at once. You just needed to stop running. Asher bent and kissed her, and the kiss on the rooftop beneath the glittering Manhattan lights below wasn't like the kiss in the hospital with the taste of tears, or the trembling, searching kiss of their first night together. This kiss was slow and deep and certain, the kiss of a man who had made a choice and wasn't turning back. When they drew apart, their foreheads resting together as the night wind carried the cold scent of a Manhattan winter past them, Felicity understood that for the first time in his life, Asher Fontaine had chosen love instead of fear, chosen to build instead of destroy, chosen her and the baby instead of the empire. But she also understood that rebuilding a life from ashes would take more than a kiss on a rooftop. It would take time. It would take courage every single day. And it would take both of them continuing to choose each other, no matter what the outside world threw at them. 3 months after that night on the rooftop, Asher Fontaine's world had changed so completely that even he sometimes had to stop in the hallway of his new office and wonder whether any of this was real. The underground empire had been dismantled piece by piece under the agreement with the FBI. Byron Shaw had been arrested along with his entire southern network, after the information Asher provided led to more than 40 arrests across the East Coast. Paige Whitford had been disbarred after evidence of her complicity in the kidnapping came to light. The legal side of the Fontaine empire had been transferred entirely to Reese to run, and Asher Fontaine, the former boss who had once controlled half of the eastern underworld of the United States, now sat in a small office on Greenwich Street, beneath a new sign hanging outside the door, Fontaine and Associates, specializing in the design of community medical facilities. Felicity still worked at the Harlem Clinic, even though her belly had grown so large that June had to force her to examine patients sitting down instead of standing. And every morning Asher drove her to the clinic before heading to his own office. The black Mercedes was still there, but everything inside it was completely different. No driver, no bodyguards, just the two of them, and the soft sound of jazz on the radio, and his hand resting on her knee every time they stopped at a red light. Their second wedding was held on a warm April afternoon in the rooftop garden of the penthouse, overlooking Central Park, glowing green beneath the summer sun, and it was small in exactly the way Felicity wanted. Only Reese stood beside Asher. Moira and June stood beside Felicity. Dr. Wells, who had cared for Asher for 2 years after the assassination attempt, sat in the front row, and an elderly pastor Moira had invited from the church she attended every Sunday officiated. Felicity wore a simple white dress, her belly round at 7 months beneath the soft fabric, her hair loose, flat shoes on her feet, because she had refused to wear heels while pregnant, even though Moira had prepared them. Asher wore a light gray suit instead of black, the first time Felicity had ever seen him in a pale color. And when she stepped out through the glass door leading to the rooftop, he looked at her with gray eyes that she now knew how to read completely, and she saw in them everything he couldn't put into words. When the pastor asked whether he wanted to say personal vows, Asher nodded, then did something Felicity never expected. He went down on one knee. His right knee touched the rooftop tiles, and she knew how much that hurt. She had seen him grit his teeth every time he bent down to tie his shoes. But he knelt in front of her, looked up at her, and said, "The first time I married you, because of a contract, because of a debt, because I needed an image to hide my weakness. This time, I marry you because you are my home. You are the only place where I don't need a cane to stand steady, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of what you've given me." Moira cried from the first sentence. June cried from the second. Reese turned his face away, but his shoulders shook, and Felicity helped Asher to his feet and kissed him before the pastor could even give permission. And the old pastor laughed and shook his head, and said that in 40 years of officiating weddings he had never seen anyone so impatient. The following summer, on a morning in late July when the trees in Central Park were deep green and a warm breeze carried the scent of sun-drenched pavement into the delivery room at Mount Sinai, Margot Fontaine came into the world. 7 pounds, healthy, her cries echoing through the entire floor. When the nurse placed the baby in Asher's arms, Felicity lay in bed watching him and saw the moment she knew would change him forever. Asher held his daughter with trembling hands, cradling her as if she were the most fragile and precious thing in the world, and tears ran freely down his face, and he didn't bother to wipe them away, didn't bother to hide them, didn't bother to feel ashamed. "Daddy's the one who limps," he whispered, looking down at the tiny sleeping face in his arms. "Daddy has done many things wrong, so many, but I promise you that you'll never know what it feels like to be abandoned. Never." Moira stood in the doorway of the delivery room, covering her face and crying. Reese stood beside her, turning his head away to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand, in the way he would deny until death if anyone asked. 3 months after Margot was born, on a summer afternoon when Felicity sat nursing the baby on the rooftop penthouse terrace, beneath the shade of the white umbrella Asher had installed just for mother and daughter, she found a letter tucked inside the book she was reading, his familiar sharp handwriting on white paper. "Felicity, 3 years ago I thought love was weakness, that control was strength, that if no one came close, then no one could hurt me. You taught me that love demands a kind of courage no bullet ever asks for, that letting another person see you completely, the scars, the disability, the darkness, is the bravest act a man can make. Thank you for choosing me when I hadn't chosen myself. Thank you for Margot, living proof that 2 broken people can create something perfect. I love you more today than yesterday, but less than tomorrow. Forever, Asher." Felicity pressed the letter to her chest, hearing her heartbeat blend with the steady breathing of Margot asleep in her arms, and felt gratitude flood her so completely she could hardly breathe. Gratitude for the strange road that had carried her from a damp studio in Brooklyn, through the law office on the 40th floor, through the penthouse, through the hospital, through the warehouse, through tears, through fear, through plus, everything, to arrive here. That night after Margot had fallen asleep in her crib, Felicity and Asher went out to the rooftop as they did every evening from the very beginning, sitting beside each other and looking out over the glittering Manhattan skyline, and Felicity asked the question she had asked many times, and never grew tired of hearing answered. "Do you regret it?" Asher was silent for a while, then said, "If I could go back to the day you walked into the penthouse with that small suitcase and those furious eyes, I wouldn't change a single second. I wouldn't change the fever. I wouldn't change the gala night. I wouldn't change the night you fainted. I wouldn't change the night you left. I wouldn't change the warehouse in Red Hook. I wouldn't change a single tear, because all of it led me here." "To where?" Felicity asked, even though she already knew the answer. "To you." Asher said, turning to look at her with gray eyes now warmer than any flame. To you, to home. They sat there beneath a sky that Manhattan was too bright to show stars. But Felicity could have sworn that night she saw stars anyway. Maybe because when you're truly happy, everywhere you look is full of light. Asher Fontaine, former Mafia boss, the man who had once believed he couldn't be loved, had learned that love wasn't weakness, but the only strength no bullet could pierce. Felicity Brennan, the broke nurse from Brooklyn, had proven that sometimes the most beautiful things are born from the most brutal circumstances, and that courage isn't the absence of fear, but feeling fear and choosing love anyway. And together they proved that two broken people doesn't mean finished. It means the chance to begin again, every day, every choice, every time they chose each other instead of choosing fear. This story is a reminder that no matter where you are in life, no matter what debt or scar you carry on your shoulders, you deserve to be loved and you have the right to begin again. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button, share this video with the people you love so that message can travel farther, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the new stories we share every day. We would love to hear how this story made you feel. Which part brought you to tears? Which part made you think of your own life or someone you love? Please write it in the comments so we can read it, because every heartfelt sharing from you is the greatest encouragement for us to keep telling meaningful stories. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and love. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.